Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our third in our Gynecologic Cancer Awareness Month webinar series here at Johns Hopkins Hospital. 3 is a very good number this evening because I have 3 of my favorite people who are some of our clinical trialists here to talk to us about clinical trials and what we labeled in our label of the talk, the needle in the haystack, uncovering the clinical trial that's right for you. And so we hope tonight that you will gain a new set of knowledge or information, whether or not you've ever been part of a clinical trial as a patient or as a family member of someone on a clinical trial in the past, that tonight will be informative and give you some new information and tools. And as I mentioned, I have 3 of my favorite people here tonight, Amy Deary and Doctors Armstrong and Gayard. And so I'd like to start with having each of them introduce themselves. And I should have picked an order and let them know, but I didn't. So I'll start with Amy because she's in my left upper corner this evening. So Amy Deary, why don't you go ahead and start us off?
I'm Amy Deary, obviously. Some of you out there may know me as Amy Horn. I've been working in GYN cancers at Hopkins for 22 years, if you can believe that. I am the lead research nurse for all of the GYN cancer clinical trials. And I've been working with Dr. Armstrong all of those 22 years, so I've known her forever as well. A fun fact about me that everybody knows I'm a rabid Ravens fan, but I'm also the current reigning champion of my fantasy football league that is 11 guys and me, and I won last year, so I defend my title. So that's just a little fun fact.
That's a great one. Dr. Gayard, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Stephanie Gayard. I am a medical oncologist and I focus on GYN cancers. I trained at Hopkins a number of years ago. I consider myself to be one of Dr. Armstrong's proteges. So, so you're going to hear some of the same things I would think from both of us, but I did leave Hopkins for a little bit, was down at Duke as faculty for a while, and then came back here a little over 3 years ago. I've also known Amy since I was in my fellowship here and working on clinical trials. And so our team goes back quite a ways, which is wonderful. It's great to have that history and continuity.
Very true. Dr. Armstrong?
So I'm Dell Armstrong. I'm also a medical oncologist, and I specialize in primarily gynecologic cancer. I also do some breast cancer and also cancer genetics. I have been here longer than all of these other people. I've been on the faculty at Hopkins for 27 years, 28 years and had done my fellowship there here at Hopkins before that. So I've been around a long time. The fun fact for me is that when I was a junior in college, I was on the University of California, Berkeley championship co-ed softball team. I was the catcher, so it wasn't like a wimpy position. And you should know that the team that we had to play to clinch that championship was led by Jerry Mathers. And so I don't know how many of you know who Jerry Mathers is. At the end, if you guys want to know, I will tell you who Jerry Mathers is. But he was the head of the team we had to beat. So it's probably one of the reasons I need a knee replacement now, because it was very, catching is very hard on your knee. Yeah.
Catching is the worst.
I have to say that the fun-filled facts always does remain my favorite part of the webinar series for each of them. So I am accumulating them and enjoying them greatly. The other thing I wanted to do as part of our introduction is I think many of us have sort of a favorite trial we've been involved in, either one in the past or the present, or maybe potentially like one we envision for the future. So for each of you, your introductions sort of explain you have a lot of history and experience. So what has been your favorite trial? Why was it your favorite, either as an individual researcher or in terms of what it contributed? So favorite trial and why, sort of. And whoever wants to go first can go first this time.
I'll go first. I actually have 2, and one of them actually was a trial of intraperitoneal chemotherapy, and we may show you a timeline slide, but this study was sort of introduced in the in the mid to late 1990s, actually got activated in the late 1990s, was completed in the early 2000s, and wasn't published until 2006. At the time, it was the longest survival for women with advanced ovarian cancer at the time. I had actually worked in kidney dialysis before I went to medical school, and my job was to teach people how to give themselves peritoneal dialysis. So this was like right up my alleyway, because I was very comfortable with these catheters, et cetera. You know, we don't give as much IP therapy now, and in part because we've actually had further improvements in treatments since 2006. But I think for me, that was probably the trial. I learned a lot because you have to review every single chart of every patient across the country. And so it was a very educational experience. But I would also say that the second trial that I think we participated in at Hopkins was the very first trial that looked at the use of Avastin, bevacizumab, in patients with ovarian cancer. And there were 60 patients on this trial across the country, and we put 6 on. So we put 10% of the patients on that trial. And all but one of them had some clinical benefit. So that was also a very big learning experience for me, because I'd never used the drug before, and we really showed how beneficial that drug was in ovarian cancer treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Those are great examples. Dr. Gayard?
Sure. So favorite trial that I guess I've been involved in is a trial through the GOG called GOG 281. It's a study that I was involved with both when I was down at Duke and then when I came here. And sort of a number of reasons it's my favorite trial. One is that it is focused on a uncommon subset of ovarian cancer, the low-grade serous ovarian cancer. And there are some very interesting differences about that subset of ovarian cancer that I'm interested in, particularly that they tend to be more responsive to endocrine therapies. They have different molecular alterations. And really, this trial came out at a time when we were starting to really think differently about the treatment of these cancers. It was also, I learned a lot. I mean, I wasn't involved in the development of the study. But it was developed in a really, I would say, very intelligent way, in a sense that it was comparing the study drug trametinib against standard of care. And there were a number of options in terms of standard of care. And that's a common design, standard phase 3 design. But the difference in this study is that it allowed crossover, and oftentimes you don't allow crossovers in studies. And what that means is that if you're assigned to an arm, for example, the standard of care treatment arm, then that's what you get. And then if it doesn't work for you or stops working for the patient, then they discontinue participation on the study. Well, this study allowed patients who were on the standard of care arm to cross over and get the study drug. So it meant that everyone on the study at some point in time would be eligible for the study drug, which it's nice for patients to have that opportunity, and especially since this was really something emerging and it's a rare disease. And hard to develop drugs for these cancers. It was a Herculean effort done by the GOG, and in particular led by Dr. Gershenson, and really required a worldwide effort, and that they pulled it off. And more than that, that it showed that the study drug was beneficial, was very exciting. And I have to say that when I was putting patients on study, you know, we would know what they were randomized to. They would get the study drug, and each patient, once they were on the trametinib, was getting benefit. And so it was just so exciting. And you just wanted to put every single patient you could on the study because we were seeing that it was helping. And, you know, unfortunately, it's not a permanent fix, and eventually the cancers do tend to progress. But there was a substantial improvement with the study drug. So it was really exciting, and hopefully should be coming out in publication soon, but is now, I think, the new standard of care for recurrent low-grade serous ovarian cancer.
Amy?
I guess mine might be a little different since I come from sort of the research nurse angle and not, you know, the more science angle. And I did some of the early IP trials with Dr. Armstrong and was able to speak and, you know, did an instructional video and all of that. But I think one of the things I really feel fortunate to be a part of, and I'm going to combine a bunch and then get to one, but I've been able to work with PARP inhibitor trials since the beginning, right? So I worked with, you know, 9923, GY, you know, 004, GY 005, Solo 1, Solo 2, Ariel 2, Ariel 3, you know, back when, you know, we were just discovering that PARP inhibitors for ovarian cancer might be, you know, this great option, you know, and as we were learning about BRCA mutations and HRD mutations in ovarian cancer and where this all fit in. And it really was a huge opportunity for me to learn about PARP inhibitors, but then also teach patients about these PARP inhibitors and how to take them, how to manage side effects, like, you know, the differences in all of them. And I think the trial that really touched me a lot was Ariel 3. I still have active patients on Ariel 3, and it was because it was a trial for women with recurrent ovarian cancer, you know, that had received chemo, you know, multiple lines of chemo, and they had an opportunity to go on this drug where you started to see that they were having these lengthy, like, periods of no progression, right? Which was shocking to me, right? Because I'm so used to, all right, well, what's going to be next and what's going to be next? And, you know, we have somebody on now that's been on for over 5 years, you know, and disease free. And we had a handful of women like that. And, you know, you start to see now, like, when are we going to add these PARP inhibitors in? Does this make sense? You know, and I think, you know, I've had people, patients and providers reach out to me over the years about how to manage PARP inhibitors, what my experience was with PARP inhibitors, which to me seemed, it was special to me as, you know, as a clinician, but also like the fact that I had, you know, the numbers of patients that had gone through this treatment that I was able to like look back on. And I feel grateful that I was able to work with so many women at the time. And now I know that it's, you know, become standard of care in a lot of situations. And I know that there are still trials. And so I feel like my knowledge now is helping me with these newer trials where we're combining PARP inhibitors with other drugs and, you know, trying to teach the body different ways to, you know, become more responsive either to chemo or other drugs. And so I feel like I got lucky to, you know, be able to get into those trials and get my ladies into these trials at the time that they were available, which has really changed my whole outlook on how we manage these ladies with recurrent ovarian cancer.
I think all of those are excellent answers and touch on many similar common themes and actually hit on some of our developments that our patients have benefited from over the past few years. And you started to touch on it a little bit, Amy, in your answer, but one of the questions that I wanted us to discuss tonight, which is, as an individual patient, why are clinical trials important to me as an individual patient? And so when you have someone who comes into your office, all three of you, and is trying to decide clinical trial versus not, what factors do you recommend people consider? Or how do you frame, not necessarily an individual trial, but the concept of enrolling on a clinical trial? How do you frame that for patients as they're trying to decide what to do?
This is Deb. I'll actually start out by, you know, anytime, whether it's a patient that I've been following for a long time or somebody who's coming to me for a second opinion or you know, to consider a clinical trial, I always, what I always do is say, you know, this is where your disease is, and this is what we consider the standard of care. This is what we would recommend in this situation. And it may be one of a number of different treatments. And then I say, you know, one of the things that we do at Johns Hopkins that's different than some other places is that we actually do clinical trials. We try to find new treatments. And so if there's a trial that someone appears to be eligible for, I will describe what that trial is. And usually, and in many cases, I say, you know, this is now, like, you know, we just talked about 4 things that you could think about. This is now a 5th thing that you can think about. And those other 4 things are always going to be there. They will still be there. They're not something that, you know, you won't be able to do because you do this trial. The trial is frequently an additional option for somebody. And so frequently that's the scenario. And then it gets into the whole issue, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but what kind of trial is it? You know, is it a randomized trial? Is there a placebo? Is there blinding? Those kinds of things. And we talk about that. But I always try to couch a clinical trial in terms of what would we normally recommend in this situation? What would we consider the standard of care? And I think that helps people to try and understand a little bit about what, you know, why we're doing the study and how it might be of benefit to them because it's an additional option.
And to add on to that, I think one of the critical questions is how good is the current standard of care? And so, you know, there are sometimes patients, and understandably, right, someone newly diagnosed with a cancer is very worried and concerned. And in some situations, our current standard of care has a very, very high chance of leading to cure. And so in those situations, there isn't really a need for a clinical trial. At that point, you don't want to mess with the standard of care. You want to make sure that the patient is getting what they need. And so sometimes patients will come in those situations and say, well, I heard about immunotherapy and I want this, you know, new thing. And I say, no, what you really want is the standard of care because that's effective. Right? And so recognizing the situation and knowing the standard of care is very important. Similarly, there are oftentimes patients who will come in with the preconceived notion that, oh, well, we only do clinical trials when there aren't good options, or the options that are out there are just sort of so-so, or I have no other option. And I would say that's also not true, because there are a lot of situations where even though we have good therapies, that our standard of care doesn't meet the bar of curing patients or curing or the treatment that is required is has a lot of toxicity to it, and there may be ways to improve on that. And so those are situations where you may consider a clinical trial to evaluate. So I think it's always critical for patients to really talk with their physicians and seek guidance on when a clinical trial may be appropriate.
I think, Amy, you probably, after all of us have introduced the idea, you then sort of walk people through the clinical trials and often the individual trials. When patients are asking you questions about how they should think about their decision, is there anything, what else do you add to what has been said?
Yeah, I was going to say, I sort of come in after the fact, you know, after they've been presented both with standard of care options and clinical trial options. And I consider myself a logistics person, you know, when it comes to the trials. I think I understand a study calendar better than most people. I don't know why, but I can break it down and explain it to patients and really help them to understand, like, what, you know, what requirements of the studies, you know, they will have to do, and compare those commitments to that of the standard of care. Which I think is helpful in a lot of cases, you know, depending on the patients. Some people are at a stage where they're thinking, you know, they want they're at work full time, or they have their kids full time or something. And they're like, you know what, if I can get chemo once every 4 weeks and only need blood work once every 4 weeks, that really fits for me right now. You know, if I'm telling them, you know, they need to get blood work every week and they need to come see us every 2 weeks and they're going to get infusions and they're going to take oral drug and they're going to do quality of life questionnaires, they're going to do this. But then I think also the questions that I get that are not logistical are, you know, how have the other patients done, right? Which is always the hardest question, right? Because as you guys know, not everybody responds the same way to any treatment. And so it makes it challenging to answer those questions. And so I talk more about how they tolerate the drugs and, you know, what their quality of life is like while they're on study and that sort of thing, and try to give them an idea of, you know, how people are doing. I also, which I think for all of us is the never ending question of the order of things, you know, when do we do which treatments? And I think the patients get very confused and they're like, well, if I do this, can I still do this later? You know, and I try to tell them, you know, yes, okay, so if you do this now, you won't be able to do this later. You know, or if you do this now, you will be able to still do this later and it will probably be open, or there may be a chance that more studies will be open. And so I guess it's more still logistical concerns and, you know, just mapping things out rather than actually helping them to make the decisions. But hopefully I think it helps them to frame it all.
Yeah, one thing I was going to add was that, this was entitled Finding a Needle in a Haystack or something like that. And I use kind of a different analogy, which is I really feel that in order for a patient to enroll on a study, sometimes the stars just have to align. And that, you know, the study has to be available. It has to have slots for enrollment. So, you know, there are studies, a period of time they're not yet able to enroll. And then, of course, once they've completed enrollment, then they're no longer able to put patients on. That all of the eligibility criteria have to be met. And those can be challenging sometimes. And that the logistics have to fall into place, meaning that it's feasible for the patient to come for whatever appointments, to tolerate whatever the treatments are, and that what we're asking them to do as part of the study, because oftentimes there's receiving the study drug, but there's a lot more that goes along with it, and that's all designed not to be difficult, but to try to answer the question, because what always happens on any study is some patients may respond and they may respond really well. Others are not going to. And it's very difficult to try to determine why someone responded and somebody else with what we think of as the same cancer doesn't respond. And so that's what a lot of the blood work is sometimes dedicated for, is research blood or research biopsies, is to try to put that into place and learn from each of the individuals on the study. But it does mean additional hurdles that participants have to go through. And so we're very grateful for every participant on a study, because as you can see, and from what Amy said, this really moves the bar in terms of standard of care. And so any drug that's available now is only available because other patients before were willing to participate on a clinical trial and help further the development of therapies for these cancers. And that's how we move forward. And so we still do a fairly, honestly mediocre job. And I don't mean us personally those of us on this call, but just in general in the oncology community in the United States in particular, of putting patients on clinical trials. There are other groups who have much higher enrollment on clinical trials. For example, it's often touted as the children's or pediatric oncology group, where they put the majority of children on a clinical trial, and that helps to advance the science faster. And so, you know, I'm certainly very passionate about clinical trials, but if we want to make progress for any of these diseases, it's by continuing to push the science forward in clinical trials. So I'll get off my soapbox.
And I would just point out that what Dr. Gayard is talking about is what what Amy was talking about is sort of like this study calendar, like what has to be done at what time. And a lot of this is looking at a lot of the things, the extra things that are done when you're on a clinical trial are part of this big thing that today is called precision medicine. And it's trying to say, yeah, if you have two women who have the same, you know, ovarian cancer, you know, why does one respond and one doesn't? And looking at circulating markers or looking at factors in their tumor before and during and after the treatment is part of this precision medicine effort, where you can say, oh, okay, so this gene is altered in this patient and she responded to therapy, but this gene was not altered in this patient and she didn't respond to therapy. And then you look across the study to see if that is a correlation with the outcome. And this is this whole thing about precision medicine. I mean, it in the era of COVID, having, you know, to justify why we want people to come in and have extra blood draws to see how they're metabolizing the drugs, extra visits to look at their toxicity, and extra visits to do things like tissue biopsies, you know, we have to really justify that. So I think, but it is sort of part of this bigger movement to what's called precision medicine, which is to sort of say, not everybody with high-grade serous ovarian cancer is alike. There are differences. And if we can define that and figure out how those differences can guide the right therapy is kind of the modern approach to clinical trials.
Yeah, I think that's great. Let's go. We've sort of framed the questions of like how we think about clinical trials in the broad sense. If we break it down, there's some jargon that we all throw about. And I think Dr. Armstrong, you mentioned we have a timeline slide that I think will lay this out. I'll pull the slide up and we can see, Dr. Gayard, do you want to go first and start us out with some of the key points on the slide about what are some of the terms that we've been using, the terminology around phase, we've used the term randomized, there's some, you know, blinded, there's some key research terms that when we talk about them are important to understand when you're thinking about clinical trials. So I am going to hopefully successfully pull this up. And
all right. Terrific.
There. So we'll use this as our guide a little bit for a few minutes to talk about some of these terms. Do you start us off with some of them?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start us off, which is, so every drug that gets developed is first studied in the lab. And that's this preclinical, can you see? Oh, yeah. I'm going to let you, Dr. Wethington, be the mouse since I don't have control of it. So this preclinical area, and that's where we're trying to understand the mechanism of action. How does this drug work? How is it metabolized? Other key features, how does it get into the cancer cells, for example? What other cells in the body that it might have effects on? And then toxicity in animals. And here it estimated that this time frame can be 3 to 6 years. And I would say, honestly, it tends to be a lot longer than that. We may identify a particular target for a drug, and that may be known in the example of P53, which is the most common mutation in high-grade serous ovarian cancer, present in greater than 95% of high-grade serous ovarian cancer, perhaps all of them. We've known about that gene for 50 years, and yet, you know, we still don't really have drugs to truly target that. But in any case, they're all studied in the lab first, so that we can gain as much information as possible. When a drug is coming out of the lab and is being considered for use in patients, they first undergo a phase 1 study. And phase 1 is actually a bucket that includes many different types of clinical types of studies. For example, some of them may be first in human, meaning that this drug has never been used in people before. Obviously, someone somewhere has to be the very first person to ever receive the drug. We need to figure out what the proper dose of the drug is and what the toxicity profile or side effect profile looks like. And so that's done in these phase 1 studies. However, it also includes studies of FDA-approved drugs that are being used in a different way. So for example, an FDA-approved drug that is being administered instead of IV, let's say it's being administered intraperitoneally, that would need to be studied in a phase 1 study. Or an FDA-approved drug that is being used now in combination with another FDA-approved drug. And even though we know the proper dose of each of those drugs individually, we don't know what the doses should be when used together. They may have overlapping toxicity profiles, and we want to make sure that giving both drugs at the same time is not going to be a safety issue. And so that's studied in a phase 1 trial. These phase 1 trials are often fairly small. Sometimes they may be at most 50 patients. Frequently, they actually span a number of different types of cancers. So you may have one patient with colon cancer, another one with breast cancer, and a third with a GYN cancer. And of course, we're always interested in how well it has worked for each of the patients enrolled in the study. What we're going to get at the end of this study is information about dosing and side effect profile, and a smidgen of information about efficacy, because all we can really say is if there was one patient with breast cancer who responded to the drug on the study, that one patient with breast cancer responded to the drug, and that's not, doesn't really help us determine whether or not this is a useful drug in the patient, in the general breast cancer population. Phase 2 is where we then get that next first look at efficacy. These tend to be sort of medium-sized trials, perhaps 100 or so patients. Now all of the patients tend to have the same type of cancer. There are other similar features about the cancer or the patient population to try to homogenize and get a sense, perhaps based on the preclinical information of what's predicted to be the best population to use it in, or the phase 1 information that may guide that as well, that you're trying to hone in on a population you think is going to be most likely to benefit. And so these sometimes are randomized studies, often are not, and everybody's receiving the same drug and the same doses at the drugs, at least to start out with. From these studies, we often get an indication of whether or not across that group of patients there was benefit. And we can typically tell you in terms of percentages, how many patients had a response to therapy, or what was the duration of time that they stayed on the therapy before their cancer got worse. Then, of course, the next question, though, is this new drug that looks promising better than what we're already doing, the standard of care. And so that's where a phase 3 study comes in, where now we want to have a larger population. These can be a few hundred patients, sometimes even thousands of patients. And we are treating patients with the study drugs, but there's also a group of patients who are going to receive what's considered the standard of care. And we're comparing those two groups. So again, we're trying to homogenize across the groups, make sure that they're similar, so that really, hopefully, the main thing that's different is what they've been treated with, so that we can see whether these drugs are better than what we're already doing. It's based on that information, and that's really what we call the gold standard that the FDA in the United States would use to evaluate whether or not the drug gets approved for that cancer. Post-approval, there's then a whole series of studies that can happen at that point. They're called post-marketing studies, or some of them are phase 4 studies. And that's where we're trying to identify further information about safety, efficacy, optimal use, perhaps, again, further honing in on subpopulations to make sure that it's safe or efficacious. And so all of this can take quite a long time. I often get the question of, gosh, why aren't things moving forward faster? And in fact, we've made a lot of advances in terms of how to design these studies to make those leaps and progress along this timeline faster, but it still just takes time. There are a number of regulatory hurdles and other things that do play into that timeline, but the FDA has understood that cancer patients want to have efficacious drugs as quickly as possible. And so they have also generated ways to help move these studies along and hopefully gain approval. Oh, you're still muted.
Ooh, it took me 3 nights to do that. I was doing okay, and then I just messed it all up. I was going through all 5 without forgetting my mute button. So that helped us sort of frame the phasing and understanding the development like beautifully, so helpful. Some of those terms, Amy or Dr. Armstrong, help us out with, like randomized and blinded and some of those other phrases, that jargon that commonly comes up. We'll start with those two. Does one of you want to help us with those definitions?
Yeah, I'll start. So a randomized trial is a trial where there will be more than one option for therapy, and the patient doesn't get to choose which option they want, and the treating providers don't get to choose which option they want. We used to call it a coin flip, but it's really a computer generated thing right now. And so, when somebody goes into the trial, as a physician, I have to be happy with all of the potential treatments they could get on the trial, and the patient has to be willing to accept those treatments. And frequently in a randomized trial, as Dr. Gayard said, it will be the standard of care versus a new agent. And the only way we really know is if that's going to, push the envelope, is to compare it to a standard of care. There are also, and Amy was talking about the Parp inhibitor studies. So this whole issue of maintenance after standard chemotherapy with Parp inhibitors, it was subject of a randomized trial. And in those situations, this is people who had finished chemotherapy, they had responded to treatment, and now they're randomized to the Parp inhibitor versus a placebo, because no treatment at the end of chemotherapy is the standard. So the placebo is the standard arm. The experimental arm is the Parp inhibitor. And again, those are blinded trials. You don't know which arm you're on, and you can't choose which arm you're on, but you will know, hey, Luke, whether or not, what the odds are that you would be able to be on any one of those arms. And so that's what the randomization is. Some people, what I usually tell people is, you will at least get the standard of care, and you might have the option of getting something investigational. And as Dr. Gayard was talking about with the GOG 281, it was a lovely trial design, because everybody who went on that trial, even if they got randomized to the standard arm, could get the investigational drug later on. So that was a trial design that was really a very easy to I think, to talk to people about, and people were enthusiastic about that. Amy, why don't you talk a little bit about this? Because Amy really spends a lot of time talking to patients about what this means.
I'm going to say, so in every clinical trial, they tell us sort of what the randomization is, or at least what the plan is. Like some are 2 to 1, some are 4 to 4 to 1 to 1 to, and they all, you have to kind of explain, how that's going to work, depending on the number of arms on a study, right? And some studies are weighted more heavily on certain arms of the study than others. So it's not just, as much as people want to say, if you're randomized, it's like flipping a coin, right? And sometimes it's a 2-sided coin. Sometimes, it's an 8-sided coin, where 50% of the time it's heads or, whatever it is. And so it does get complicated, but I do spend time going over what that randomization is for the specific study. I think you're right, Stephanie Wethington, in saying that patients get confused. They're like, well, what does it mean to be blinded? And are you blinded? Are we just blinded? Is the pharmacy blinded? And it's different in every trial. In some cases, even the pharmacy doesn't know if you're getting the drug or if you're not getting the drug. So it can be, that's what we call double blind. Or most of the time, we are blinded to it as your providers, but the pharmacy is aware of the drug, but you, the patient, and us, the providers, don't know whether or not you're getting the drug. I think placebo is sort of a 4-letter word, everybody gets very nervous about placebos. But then again, just as Dr. Armstrong just mentioned, you're never going to not get treatment. We're not, you have cancer, you are going to get treatment, and you may get additional drug. I think it's not necessarily a buzzword, but I think one of the questions that we get a lot in trials, especially for women with recurrent GYN cancers, is how long am I going to be on the trial? Because in initial therapy, we sort of tell them, well, you're going to have 6 cycles of treatment, or you're going to have 4 cycles, or, there's a set plan in mind. And when it comes to trials, especially, like I said, in recurrent disease, they can be open-ended. So, as long as you're receiving a benefit, we're going to keep going, or there could have a maximum of, say, 24 months, and so I think that's another big question I get when it comes to trials that's very different from standard of care therapy. You usually think, all right, well, I got 3 cycles, I'm going to get a scan. They told me I'd probably get 6 cycles. And then, so I think that's a big change in how their brain works when they start thinking about treatment. Just because this is a current problem I'm experiencing. Another question is about who pays for clinical trials. And, and the whole insurance clearance process, and it can get quite complicated, but in every consent form, there's a page that's included that goes over what costs are covered by the clinical trial, and then what costs are expected to be standard of care and covered by the patient's insurance. And before anybody can enroll on a clinical trial, we have to get permission from their insurance company to enroll, and they acknowledge that they will be covering whatever those standard of care costs are. We also remind patients that in those situations, they are still responsible for deductibles or co-pays or things like that. If they're what we would normally be doing standard of care wise, it's just like it would be through your insurance. And then we tell you what's covered by the trial, which you won't be billed for, your insurance will not be billed for. And I think that causes a lot of questions with people as well.
I will point out that I think this is actually one of the pieces of good news that's changed over, and Amy can confirm this, certainly over the last couple of decades, which is that a lot of insurance companies used to absolutely would not cover the cost of any part of your care on a clinical trial, even the standard costs of care, like the blood count that you needed before you got treatment. And that's actually really changed. And we used to see this a lot because, believe it or not, the federal Blue Cross Blue Shield program used to actually exclude patients from participating in any clinical trials. And because of where we live, we have a lot of patients who have had federal insurance. So now almost all insurances will cover the standard of care costs for people on a clinical trial. And Amy, you can tell me, but it's been a long time since we've had anybody declined. The other thing that we do is when clinical trials go through a process of approval at the institution, they go through something called a review board. And part of that process is that somebody goes through the clinical trial with a fine-tooth comb and they say, okay, this is standard of care, this is research. And then they actually create this big table that's several pages long, like what would be covered by, is considered standard of care and should be covered by insurance, and what is a research that you can't bill for. And so that process is actually done for every clinical trial that we do. One of the pieces of good news is that now insurance authorization it's very rare for us to get a decline for insurance authorization. Amy would know more than me, but I can't remember the last time I've had a patient whose insurance declined.
Yeah, it's a very rare occasion. I think in most of them you can appeal and actually get coverage if they do deny it. I think that there are a few like self-funded personal like insurances out there that will still say no trials, but I mean it's usually those patients or people will have sort of backup insurance that will then cover. But I know now you're right. The federally funded insurance companies were the worst, TRICARE and Federal Blue Cross Blue Shield, which seems crazy because these are all government funded trials and they couldn't actually enroll in the trials. And so I think, I guess it's probably been right. Like
about 20 years. But I remember having a nurse at the NIH who couldn't go on an NIH-sponsored trial because Federal Blue Cross Blue Shield wouldn't let her go on. So that is one of the pieces of good news that's a hurdle that we rarely have to address anymore.
And in addition to that, it's also very clear now, as Amy pointed out, you get a sheet that spells it out. It's very clear to the study team, to the insurances, to the patient. So everyone, it's all above board, and there was certainly a time when it was much less clear. And so patients would end up with bills and they weren't sure, was that standard of care or not standard of care? Who was supposed to be paying for it? And it got very difficult for patients to navigate that. And that has gotten a lot easier.
Dr. Armstrong, you mentioned briefly the review board, the institutional review boards that review clinical trials. And I want to just briefly touch on, I think a lot of patients ask, well, if I'm on a trial, like what keeps me safe? What are the safety mechanisms that are in place? And so I just was wondering if you could address that. How do we ensure safety on clinical trials?
Yeah, and because we do a lot of research at Johns Hopkins, we actually have 6 regular IRBs, and we have a different one at Bayview, and then we have one that's called IRB-X, which is for sort of simpler studies where people are just kind of looking at records. They're not actually doing an intervention. But the IRBs usually have somewhere around 8 to 10 members on them. They have consent form specialists. They have a lawyer on every board, and there's a patient representative, a consumer representative on every one of the boards. At Hopkins, for oncology or for cancer trials, we actually sort of have a 2-phase. It goes through a scientific review at the oncology center level, and that's to make sure that we think it's scientifically sound, number one. Number two is that within a group, let's say it's the lung cancer group, you don't have 5 studies for the same population because you'd sort of be chopping yourself off at the knees if you did that, and to make sure that the priority lists for the trials that are available are correct. And then at the IRB, it's largely safety. Our focus is always, is this safe? Does the communication with the patient, which is usually a consent form, does it have all of the information that the patient needs to make an educated decision? There are also sometimes flyers or things that might be recruiting patients. We want to make sure those are fair and just. We also want to make sure that no patient ever feels coerced to participate in a trial. And in fact, if a person who's doing a trial, an investigator, has a financial relationship with the sponsor of the trial, they actually can't consent patients for that trial. So we actually have a whole conflict of interest part of that as well. So it's a very intensive process, but it's there the IRBs are really there for patient safety. And it's a big part of what we do.
I think that's very helpful. We hit on a lot of things. I'll tell you one experience I had, Amy, you'll probably remember this. When I first started, I misspoke when I was using language with a patient about the clinical trial. The screening process, when someone's being evaluated for a clinical trial, someone's found an institution, they found a trial that they're interested in, they send us their records, we look through them. What's sort of that initial workup process, screening versus enrollment versus actually going on trial? And what, from a patient standpoint, what are some of the experiences or hiccups that can happen along the way that aren't necessarily, that happen not frequently, but infrequently, but that could happen as we evaluate eligibility and get people enrolled?
We're going to let Amy answer this one.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, so I was going to say, this is the other question that comes up. I was just thinking about that, is why is the eligibility criteria so strict? And so you're right. So we do an initial review of the records and deem people, generally eligible, right? You've got the right disease, you've had the right number of prior regimens, your CT scan looks like it would fit, as far as having measurable disease or having biopsiable disease. But until we see you in person at our facility and do our own assessment, and the assessment is a physical assessment, it's also, the blood work or biopsy or review of images or, all of these things that have to be done in order to truly say you're eligible. And then once we do all of the testing that's involved in screening, then it goes to, the sponsor of the study for approval, for final approval to then enroll. And there's a reason for that, right? I mean, the eligibility criteria is so strict so that we can get the best results possible and move that timeline of getting these drugs approved faster if they indeed do help and work, and I think it's hard because you look at somebody and you say, oh, well, you're eligible. And then, one lab comes back where maybe their kidney function is just like a little bit off, or their hemoglobin is a little bit off, or their outside physician forgot to mention they had this prior treatment or this prior history of something that would exclude them from the study, and so it's, you're never in until you're, fully evaluated and in. And I think, patients almost get offended when you tell them they're not eligible after, going through all of this, and you feel so terrible because, as Stephanie Gayard will attest to, I desperately try to get patients on study. I will do whatever I can to make it work, and you feel super disappointed when something doesn't go the right way. But it's, ultimately it's nothing they did wrong. It's, just that in order to keep these trials clean and, get good results and eventually get to the FDA, we need a very, very similar patient population. And, that's why we have to follow such strict criteria, as painful as it is sometimes.
And I would also point out that this is where, when you as a patient are looking through the internet for trials, it's really difficult. I mean, I have to say, for us, even looking at the clinical trials website and the eligibility, this may be a trial with a phase 1B and a phase 2 part of it, and you don't know which part's open, and the eligibility is different. And so it's very difficult as a patient to look through that and figure out that eligibility issue. And we completely appreciate that. I also would sort of say, if you're on the internet and you're looking at, you look up, new drugs for ovarian cancer, and, something says, this has great promise in ovarian cancer, and somebody comes to you and says, can I get this drug? Well, a mouse hasn't even gotten it yet. It's a petri dish where the promise is. And there's a sort of famous saying in research, we've cured a lot of cancer in mice, that haven't turned out in people. And so a lot of times, when I go, people will give me the name of a drug that I haven't heard of before, and I go look, and it's preclinical data. It's that first little thing that on Dr. Gayard's chart, where they're looking at it in the laboratory and, oh, it looks promising, but it's not ready for prime time yet. And so it's hard to go on the internet and figure things out. but even when you're really looking at a site that is supposed to help guide you to trials like clinicaltrials.gov, that it's hard to know the eligibility. And some things will be on there that may be applicable only to one part of the trial or to a specific group of patients in the trial. We now have trials that are called bucket or basket trials where it's like, if you have mutation X, you can go in this and you can have pancreatic cancer or ovarian cancer or breast cancer, as long as you've got mutation X, but their criteria for different diseases will be different. So it gets to be quite complicated. So we certainly appreciate that you guys have trouble looking at trying to find trials. It's almost always requires you to talk to somebody. And most of the large cancer centers have somebody that you can either send an email to or talk to and get in touch with to do that pre-screen, like, oh, this allows 3 prior therapies and you've had 4, those kinds of things. So you don't waste your time looking at those studies.
Yeah, and that goes along to what I was saying earlier about having all the stars align for a patient actually to enroll on a study. I mean, there are so many different things along the way until you've actually received that first dose of drug. You know, I'm always holding out hope that we're going to get the patient started, but until that first dose is received, they haven't actually started. So.
I think one of the other questions I know I've gotten from patients when they've come for second opinions, and I know Dr. Armstrong and Dr. Gayard, you do quite a few second opinions, especially with regards to available clinical trials. And patients say, well, I have my doctor at home who I really like, and I don't want to leave my doctor, but what happens when I'm on the clinical trial? Can I get things done locally? Like, how do I balance all this? So how do you advise patients when they're trying to figure out that piece, when they have a really good relationship with their primary doctor, but maybe they're in a community center where there aren't clinical trials and they're coming to a tertiary center for a clinical trial?
Yeah, so it's a partnership, and certainly something that the clinical trials that are being done at that center, and most of the time, the infusion for the drugs and the other key parameters or key parts of the study cannot be done elsewhere. They need to be done at one of the sites that's participating in the study. And sometimes it may be a study that has only one site or a handful of sites, or sometimes these larger studies may have many, many sites, but you do need to go to a site that is participating in the study. At the same time, though, if someone is traveling for a study, so often during that time that they're enrolled in the study, I'm taking over their care during that time frame. But if someone is traveling for the study and they're not immediately local, then it's really a partnership with the local oncologist, because I need eyes and ears closer to the patient. Because if the patient develops some sort of problem that might be a side effect of the drug or a complication of the drug, then I want them to be seen by someone who understands what cancer therapy looks like and what toxicities of cancer therapy looks like. And so I always try to make sure that I'm engaging the local oncologist, that they're aware of and part of the partnership, because I do really rely on them during that. And most of the time, patients will go back to receive standard therapy after the study with their primary oncologist.
I would also agree. I think, I think both Dr. Wethington, Dr. Gayard, and I, and Amy now, because she's so well established, we get emails from doctors outside who have patients, and they're at a transition in terms of their treatment, and they want to know, is there a clinical trial? They're trying to do the best for their patient. And so we usually will send it to Amy and ask her because she's the font of all knowledge when it comes to eligibility requirements. But, you know, for most of the doctors in our community, you know, they really want their patients to be able to access care, even if they don't get it through them. I mean, we have lots of our patients, for example, who may go to the NIH for a clinical trial at some point in time. Or I have some patients who may go up to Memorial Sloan Kettering or Penn for a trial because we've figured out that there's something there and that they're interested in. And so that's usually not, I mean, for the patient, it can sometimes be that travel and that distance is an issue, but I don't think there's a lot of territoriality between doctors. We all want what's the best for the patient. We also don't want people, to feel like you're going to have to handle the problems and toxicities of this treatment that we're giving. But, so it's really a very much hand-in-hand thing. But if you have a patient who's 2.5 hours away, who's getting a therapy, and they have something sort of acute, you don't want them to be driving 2.5 hours. You want them to be seeing somebody local. So it really is usually, a hand-in-hand thing that we work with the local oncologists that patients have.
I think to end, because we're at the very end, and I always want more time, so I apologize that we're at the end, but I want to end with what I think is a very conceptually important question to our patients. And actually, Dr. Gaillard, your analogy is wonderful and a much better, the stars aligning is a much better analogy than my needle in the haystack analogy that I chose for the title tonight in terms of the matching. And I chose the needle in the haystack analogy because I feel that even with all the trials we have at Johns Hopkins and at many institutions around the country, we have seen a decrease, actually sort of numerically, in the number of GYN cancer trials available to women. And so sometimes there'll be somebody who's interested in a trial and we can't quite find, finding the right trial for them is a little bit like a needle in a haystack. And so I've had many patients over the years ask me, well, what can I do? How do I, there aren't enough trials for GYN cancer patients. Sometimes they'll name another disease site and sort of longingly say, well, that disease site has so many trials and my disease site is so important and it doesn't seem to be getting the attention. And so I sort of want to end on that in line with the theme of the month of awareness for GYN cancer, sort of if a patient says, what do I do to increase the number of GYN cancer trials, or what are opportunities, or why is this, by the way, and what can I do about it?
So I'll start and then anybody can chime in. One of the things is being vocal and talking more about cancer, about specific cancers, of supporting organizations that are doing that, both doing research and promoting clinical trials. All of us as who are academics at Hopkins are promoting clinical trials. We're educating patients. We're educating people beyond the institution. I participated and moderated a session yesterday for something called the Women's Health Innovation Summit. And it was actually really interesting because it brought together people who are developing investment funds for pharma, developers of different technologies for diagnostic approaches, and then somebody involved in artificial intelligence and big data and all of that. And the whole summit was all focused around how do we boost interest and participation and focus on women's health. And this particular roundtable was on oncology specifically. And so the word is getting out there. I think we need to do more of it. And a lot of that comes from just speaking out at all different levels, from the patient level, making your concerns known through different advocacy groups, at the academics level, at the local oncology level, saying we need more of these trials, at the national cooperative group trials levels. So really just trying to speak out and get more focus, more attention on these diseases.
Dr. Wethington can maybe talk a little bit about the like Stride to Thrive and some of the fundraising that we do at the local level. There are two organizations, the NOC, the National Ovarian Cancer Coalition, and then OKRA, the Ovarian Cancer Research Alliance. And both of those are national organizations that are sort of grassroots organizations, but that advocate for clinical trials and other support for women with ovarian cancer. And I will point out that that one of the largest ways of funding ovarian cancer research is through something called the Department of Defense. And it's a long story about why the Department of the Defense does this, but the funding for that has to be reallocated every single year. And both the Ovarian Cancer Research Alliance and National Ovarian Cancer Coalition, they go to Capitol Hill every year and they pound the pavement and they talk to the folks who make this decision. And touch wood, we have been able to go up from our basal of about $20 million in ovarian cancer research a year to $30 million, even in the current climate. So that's really a testament to the survivors that work with this group, with these groups. And so there's certainly, I think, you don't have to go up to the Hill, but there's certain are things about writing your Congress people and things like that that you can get involved with if you're interested in advancing research into ovarian cancer. And I think both of those organizations would be good places.
And beyond ovarian cancer, I'll just tout the Foundation for Women's Cancers that does focus on other GYN cancers as well. And that's a great starting point for identifying other ways of promoting further emphasis in this area.
Yeah. I think those are all great ways to end. And I do have a special place in my heart for our own survivorship program here at Johns Hopkins. And as you can tell from these webinars, it's a passion of mine and something we are trying very hard to spread awareness. So we do have normally our conference every September, which we obviously can't have this year. And then we have a race every spring to raise awareness and raise funds to help fund our research program here. So at the Johns Hopkins local grassroots effort, that is what we focus on, and we work with the Women's Cancer Foundation and with NOC and with OCRA very closely, and are very fortunate that OCRA has supported our Women to Women programs. So all of these programs are sort of key institutions. So there's lots of opportunity. Thank you guys so much. I promised I would end on time and I'm only 5 minutes, but I was right that we could keep going for much longer. So
just as a follow-up to my introduction, if anybody doesn't know who Jerry Mathers is, Jerry Mathers is the actor who played Leave It to Beaver.
That's right, I had forgotten that.
Jerry Mathers as the Beaver, that was the introduction.
Absolutely. That's fabulous. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a very good night. And we hope we see you next week, where we're going to do a session on mind matters. And we're going to focus on different mind matters. So we're going to have one of our chaplains, Rhonda Cooper, on. We're going to have a therapist on with us. And we're going to have someone who specializes in neurocognitive effects of chemotherapy. So a very interesting, eclectic session of topics that all meet because they all affect our minds. So we'll see everybody next week. And thank you again, everybody.